My grandfather left me an inheritance, including 1.5 million euros for a rainy day. When my parents found out about it, they sued me and forged the will to frame me. I don't even know where to begin. I've been sitting in front of this screen for hours now, wondering if it's worth writing this out. It's a long story, so buckle up if you decide to stick around. Growing up, I always felt out of place in my own family. I'm not sure when I started noticing the cracks, but it was early on, probably when I was 6 or 7. I can vividly remember sitting at the dinner table, watching my parents treat me like an inconvenience. They weren't physically abusive, but they made sure I knew I wasn't what they wanted. Every time I made a mistake, their disappointment piled on like a heavy weight, as if I had been born solely to ruin their perfect life plans. My father, Robert, was a successful corporate lawyer. To him, appearance was everything. He measured his self-worth by the size of his bank account and the car he parked in the driveway. He was the type who wore tailored suits, slick back hair, and kept everything polished on the outside. But inside, he was hollow. He barely acknowledged me unless it was to criticize me for not being more like him. "Why can't you be like your cousin Alexander?" he'd say. "If you don't start pulling your weight, you'll end up flipping burgers." My mother, Claire, wasn't any better. She was the queen of passive-aggressive comments, always hinting that I was a disappointment. She wanted a child she could show off, a little accessory to flaunt at her social gatherings. Instead, she got me a quiet, awkward kid who didn't fit her mold. Her version of love was conditional, cold, and suffocating. She would give me gifts, then later remind me how much they cost, expecting gratitude like some kind of transactional emotional payoff. But then there was my grandfather, Charles. He was my dad's father, and honestly, the only person who ever truly saw me. Grandfather Charles was a quiet man, full of wisdom. He wasn't flashy or wealthy like my parents, but he had this calm, grounded presence. He lived through tough times and never lost his ability to appreciate the small things in life. Every time I felt crushed under my parents' criticism, I'd run to him. He lived a couple of towns over, so I didn't get to see him as much as I'd like, but when I did, it felt like I could breathe again. He taught me so many things: how to build things with my hands, how to think critically, how to be patient. He never had much formal education, but he was one of the smartest people I've ever known. I'll never forget how he used to talk about life, like it was a series of lessons and every challenge was just another opportunity to grow. Whenever my parents tore me down, he was the one who built me back up. School was hell for me, but that probably comes as no surprise. I was the awkward, skinny kid with no confidence and even fewer friends. I tried to fit in, tried so hard, but I always felt like an outsider. Kids can be cruel, and when they sense weakness, they attack. So, I learned to keep my head down and avoid attention. It was easier that way, at least until high school. I thought high school would be different, that maybe I'd find my place, but it was just more of the same. I was invisible to most people, except when someone wanted to make a joke at my expense. And at home, things were worse. My parents had given up trying to mold me into their perfect image and had settled for barely tolerating my existence. I spent as much time as I could at Grandfather Charles's house, avoiding home whenever possible. Then something unexpected happened. Through some twist of fate, I got accepted into university. Not just any university, but a prestigious one. My grades weren't particularly great, but I had a talent for writing, and I'm pretty sure my admission essay is what did it. For the first time, I felt like maybe things were going to change. I packed my bags and left home with the kind of excitement that comes from finally breaking free from the people who had suffocated me for so long. But of course, life had other plans. University wasn't as easy as I had imagined. Sure, I was free from my parents, but I had no idea how to navigate life on my own. My first year was a blur of anxiety, loneliness, and the overwhelming pressure to succeed. I thought getting into university would be the hard part, but staying afloat was even harder. I barely scraped by with my grades, and socially. Let's just say I wasn't the life of the party. During this time, I barely spoke to my parents. My mom would occasionally send a text, asking about my grades or reminding me of some family obligation. My dad? Silent as always. The only person I stayed in touch with was Grandfather Charles. He called me every week, without fail. He'd tell me to hang in there, that things would get better, and that I was stronger than I knew. Those calls were a lifeline. But right before my second year of university started, everything changed. I got a call from my father. That alone was strange, but when I answered, his voice was quieter than usual. I immediately knew something was wrong. He told me Grandfather Charles had passed away. It didn't make sense. The last time we talked, he seemed fine. He was supposed to be indestructible, the one person I could always count on. But now he was gone just like that. My father's voice on the other end of the line was cold, emotionless, like he was delivering the weather forecast instead of breaking my heart. "It's time to grow up," he said. "You don't need to be coddled anymore." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My parents had taken everything from me over the years, my self-esteem, my sense of belonging, but Grandfather Charles had always been there, a buffer against their coldness. Now, even he was gone. After the funeral, I couldn't go back to university. I tried for a few weeks, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the fact that the only person who ever truly loved me was gone. So, I ran. I packed up my things and left university in the middle of the night. No one knew where I went. I didn't tell my parents, didn't tell anyone. I just drove. I had some savings from part-time jobs and used it to get as far away as possible. I ended up in a small town not far from where my grandfather had lived. I found a cheap apartment and took whatever odd jobs I could find to get by. It wasn't glamorous, but for the first time, I felt like I had some control over my life. No one was telling me what to do or who to be. I was finally free. A few months after settling into my new life, I got a call from a lawyer. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just a scam or a debt collector. But when I finally listened to the message, it was about Grandfather Charles's will. He had left me an inheritance, and the lawyer said I needed to come in. I wasn't expecting much, maybe some of his old tools or his worn-out car. But when I arrived at the lawyer's office, I was handed a file that changed everything. Grandfather Charles had left me everything. The house, his savings, investments I didn't even know he had. In total, over 1.5 million euros. I nearly fell out of my chair. The man who had lived so simply, who never flaunted anything, had been quietly saving his entire life, preparing for something. For me. But the biggest shock came when I read the letter he'd left for me. In it, he wrote that he had always believed in me, even when no one else did. He said he'd saved this money because he knew I'd need it one day, not just to survive, but to build something of my own, something that was truly mine. After that, I moved into Grandfather Charles's house permanently. It felt right, like I was meant to be there. I quit the odd jobs and took some time to figure out what I wanted to do. For the first time, I had choices. I invested part of the inheritance in opening a small restaurant. Cooking had always been a passion of mine, and I wanted to create a space where people could feel at home, just like I did with my grandfather. The restaurant was a success. It wasn't fancy, but it became a cozy local spot where people loved to gather. Word spread, and soon we had regular customers coming in from the city. It was more than I had ever dreamed of. But then, just when I thought my life was finally coming together, my parents came back into the picture. They had heard about the restaurant's success, and suddenly, I wasn't a disappointment anymore. My mother called, acting like she cared, subtly hinting that she and my father should come visit. I shut that down immediately. A few months later, they sued me, claiming that they were entitled to part of my inheritance. They even produced a forged version of my grandfather's will, trying to prove that they were the rightful heirs. It was a long, painful legal battle, but in the end I won. The court saw through their lies, and the forged will was thrown out. After the trial, I cut all ties with them. They had shown their true colors, and there was no going back. I had built my life without them, and I didn't need their approval or validation anymore. I was free, truly free. Looking back, I realized that the greatest gift Grandfather Charles ever gave me wasn't the money or the house. It was the belief in myself. He saw something in me that no one else did, and he gave me the tools to build a life of my own. For the first time, I feel at peace knowing that I've made something of myself, something real.